The 28th of May, 1918, arrived with a pre-dawn fog that clung to the wheat fields of Picardy like a burial shroud. In the trenches before the village of Cantigny, 28,000 American soldiers of the 1st Division stood ready to write their names into the annals of warfare. For months, the Allied commanders had questioned whether these eager young men from Kansas farms and New York tenements possessed the mettle to face the battle-hardened German army. This morning would provide the answer with bullets and bayonets. Major General Robert Lee Bullard, commander of the 1st Division, had spent the previous night pacing through his headquarters, reviewing maps that had been studied until their edges frayed. The weight of expectation pressed upon his shoulders like physical burden. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, had made the stakes abundantly clear. America needed a victory, something tangible to justify the sacrifice of sending her sons across the Atlantic. The French army, bloodied by 4 years of mechanized slaughter, watched with desperate hope. The British, ground down in Flanders mud, needed proof that their new ally could fight. The Germans, who had just launched their massive spring offensive and stood merely 40 miles from Paris, viewed the Americans with contemptuous amusement. Cantigny itself appeared unremarkable, a cluster of stone buildings and a medieval church tower that German observers had transformed into a fortress of observation. From this elevated position, enemy artillery officers could direct fire across miles of Allied territory. The village had fallen into German hands during their spring advance, and Kaiser Wilhelm's troops had fortified it with the methodical precision that characterized Prussian military doctrine. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Barbed wire stretched in tangled barriers. Underground bunkers provided shelter from artillery bombardment. Colonel Hanson Ely commanded the 28th Infantry Regiment, the unit selected to lead the assault. A West Point graduate with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for thoroughness, Ely had drilled his men relentlessly. They had practiced the attack on replica trenches constructed behind the lines, timing each movement until squads could advance with choreographed precision. French advisors, veterans of Verdun and the Somme, had shared hard-won lessons about trench warfare's brutal realities. According to historical accounts documented in the United States Army's official records and contemporary newspaper dispatches from the period, the preparation for Cantigny represented the most intensive training American forces had yet received in France. Lieutenant George Marshall, serving on Bullard's staff and destined for greater fame in a future war, had helped coordinate the complex logistics. Ammunition stockpiles, medical stations, communication lines, reserves positioned for counterattacks. Every detail required attention. The French had provided crucial support: flamethrower teams, tank detachments, and most importantly, artillery batteries whose guns would pound German positions for 3 hours before the infantry advanced. As darkness yielded to gray light on that May morning, American soldiers checked weapons with trembling fingers. Many had never seen combat. They came from every corner of the vast republic: farmhands and factory workers, college students and immigrants still learning English. They carried Springfield rifles, wore British-style helmets, and marched in French boots. But the flag on their shoulders belonged to America alone. The artillery barrage commenced at 5:45 in the morning, transforming the pastoral French countryside into an inferno of steel and fire. 3,000 shells screamed overhead in the opening minutes alone, French 75s joining American guns in a symphony of destruction. The earth itself seemed to convulse as high explosive rounds carved craters where moments before wheat had grown. German positions disappeared beneath curtains of smoke and flame. The ancient church tower, which had stood since the 13th century, shuddered under direct hits. Captain Clarence Hubner, commanding a company in the 28th Infantry, watched the bombardment from the forward trench with grim satisfaction. A 29-year-old officer who had risen through the ranks, Hubner understood that this preparatory fire represented more than mere tactics. Each shell carried American resolve, announcing to the world that the United States had arrived on the Western Front not as spectator, but as combatant. The young soldiers around him flinched at the concussive waves rolling over their positions. Some prayed. Others stared at photographs of sweethearts and mothers they might never see again. In the German trenches, Lieutenant Friedrich Weber of the 82nd Reserve Division crouched in a reinforced dugout as the bombardment transformed the world above into chaos. Weber, a veteran of 3 years fighting on both Eastern and Western fronts, had learned to recognize the distinctive patterns of different national artillery. These shells, he noted with professional interest, fell with American enthusiasm but French precision. The combination proved devastating. Communications wires severed. Observation posts collapsed. Men who ventured from their bunkers were shredded by shrapnel or buried alive when trenches caved inward. The barrage continued with relentless fury, methodically working across German positions according to carefully prepared fire plans. American artillery officers, many trained at French gunnery schools, adjusted ranges based on aerial reconnaissance photographs. Spotter planes circled above the smoke, their observers noting which strong points still showed signs of resistance. Radio operators transmitted coordinates to battery commanders, who ordered corrections. The guns, positioned wheel to wheel in concealed emplacements, fired until their barrels glowed red. At 6:45, precisely 3 hours after the bombardment commenced, Lieutenant Samuel Parker blew his whistle. Along a front extending 2,500 yards, American infantrymen climbed from their trenches and began advancing across no man's land. They moved in waves, squads maintaining intervals as doctrine prescribed, rifles held ready. French flame-throwing teams accompanied the first assault elements, their equipment designed to incinerate any defenders who remained in forward positions. Renault tanks, primitive machines prone to mechanical failure but terrifying in appearance, rumbled forward to crush wire obstacles. The German response came swiftly despite the pulverizing bombardment. Machine guns that had survived in deep dugouts emerged to rake the advancing Americans with interlocking fields of fire. Men fell in windows, cut down before they comprehended what killed them. The survivors pressed forward just as training had dictated, moving through the enemy fire rather than seeking cover from it. This represented fundamental doctrine. Momentum mattered more than casualties in the crucial minutes of an assault. Sergeant Jeremiah Evarts, a mill worker from Massachusetts before the war, found himself leading his decimated squad toward a German machine gun nest that fired from a fortified position near the church. Half his men lay dead or wounded in the wheat behind him. Evarts carried a satchel of grenades, and as bullets snapped past his head, he zigzagged toward the German position with the desperate speed of a man who knows survival requires aggression. The village itself materialized through drifting smoke like a ghost town emerging from fog. Cantigny's stone buildings, once homes to farming families, had been transformed into fortified positions bristling with weaponry. Every cellar concealed German soldiers. Every window framed a rifle barrel. The church tower, partially collapsed from artillery strikes, still contained snipers who picked off American officers with methodical precision. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the former president's eldest son serving with the 26th Infantry Regiment, led his men through this labyrinth of death with a revolver in one hand and a walking stick in the other, as if strolling through Central Park rather than entering combat's furnace. Sergeant Evarts reached the machine gun nest and hurled his grenades through the firing slit. The detonation silenced the weapon, but another immediately opened fire from a position 30 yards to the left. The Americans had entered a killing zone where German defenders enjoyed every advantage. They knew the terrain intimately, had prepared fallback positions, and fought with the desperate ferocity of men defending conquered ground. Yet the attackers possessed something the Germans had not anticipated, an almost reckless determination born from months of perceived slights about American martial capability. Captain Hubner's company fought house to house through the village's eastern edge. Privates who had trained on Kansas rifle ranges found themselves clearing rooms with grenades and bayonets, skills acquired hastily during final preparations in France. The close-quarters combat devolved into primal savagery. Men grappled hand-to-hand in darkened cellars. Flamethrowers incinerated defenders who refused to surrender. The civilized veneer of warfare, thin even in the best circumstances, vanished entirely in Cantigny's ruins. By 7:30 in the morning, scarcely 45 minutes after the infantry assault commenced, American soldiers controlled most of the village. The speed of their advance surprised even optimistic Allied observers. German survivors retreated toward secondary defensive positions east of Cantigny, maintaining fire discipline as they withdrew. Colonel Ely established his command post in the battered remains of the mayor's office, immediately organizing the defense he knew must follow. Capturing Cantigny represented only the first phase of the operation. Holding it against inevitable German counterattacks would prove far more difficult. The German High Command reacted with alarm to reports that Americans had taken Cantigny. Crown Prince Wilhelm, commanding the German Fifth Army, ordered immediate counterattacks to reclaim the position. For the Germans, this represented more than losing a tactical observation post. Allowing the Americans to hold conquered ground would embolden Allied morale while suggesting German vulnerability. Artillery batteries redirected their fire, beginning a bombardment that would continue for 3 days with scarcely any pause. The shells fell with such intensity that the ground became a moonscape of overlapping craters. Private Michael Donovan, an Irish immigrant from Boston who had enlisted within days of America declaring war, huddled in a hastily scraped shelter as German artillery transformed Cantigny into an inferno worse than the American bombardment that preceded the attack. The earth heaved and buckled. Stone buildings that had survived centuries collapsed into rubble. Men screamed for medics, their voices barely audible above the constant explosions. Donovan clutched his rifle and wondered if he would survive to see nightfall. The German counterattacks began at 1100 hours on that first morning. Wave after wave of field gray infantry emerging from the smoke-shrouded tree lines east of the village. These were veteran troops. Many transferred from the Eastern Front after Russia's collapse, soldiers who understood the rhythms of assault and defense with instinctive mastery. They advanced in disciplined formations, seeking to overwhelm the American positions through sheer weight of numbers and tactical sophistication earned through years of combat. Lieutenant Parker, now commanding his company after the captain fell wounded, directed defensive fire from a position behind a collapsed stone wall. His men, exhausted from the morning's assault, found reserves of strength born from desperation. Machine guns hammered the advancing Germans, cutting swaths through their ranks. Riflemen fired as rapidly as they could work their bolts, not bothering to aim carefully, but instead creating a wall of lead. Artillery support, pre-registered on likely approach routes, dropped curtains of high explosive across the German formations. The first counterattack broke against American defenses like waves against coastal rocks. Bodies piled in the wheat fields, adding to the grotesque harvest already gathered. But the Germans reorganized and attacked again, probing for weak points in the hastily established defensive perimeter. They infiltrated through communication trenches, emerged from craters thought cleared, materialized from shell-damaged buildings. The fighting devolved into a confused melee, where soldiers sometimes could not distinguish friend from enemy until within arm's reach. Corporal William Grimes, a Tennessee farmer before the war, discovered a German infiltration team attempting to work behind American lines through a collapsed section of trench. He killed 3 with his rifle before his weapon jammed, then fought the remaining 2 with his entrenching tool, wielding it like a medieval axe. Such individual actions, multiplied across hundreds of small struggles occurring simultaneously, determined whether the Americans would hold their conquest or be driven back in disgrace. Colonel Ely, observing the battle's ebb and flow from his command post, faced the commander's eternal dilemma: when to commit reserves. Throw them in too early and risk having nothing remaining for the next crisis. Wait too long and watch the defensive line collapse. He studied reports flowing in from company commanders, assessed the patterns of German attacks, and made his decisions with the cold calculation necessary for command. When a particularly dangerous penetration threatened to split the American position, he personally led a counterattack that restored the line, rallying soldiers by his presence more than his words. The day wore on through afternoon into evening, each hour bringing fresh German attempts to recapture Cantigny. American casualties mounted steadily. Medical stations overflowed with wounded. Ammunition ran low in forward positions until supply parties made desperate runs through the artillery fire. Communication lines were cut and restored and cut again. Runners sprinted between positions carrying messages, many falling before reaching their destinations. Yet the line held. As darkness fell on the 28th of May, 1918, the village of Cantigny remained in American hands. The soldiers who had captured it that morning had been transformed by their baptism of fire. They had discovered truths about themselves, both exalting and horrifying, that no training could reveal. Some had found courage they did not know they possessed. Others had learned they could kill without hesitation when survival demanded it. A few had broken under the strain, cowering in shell holes despite threats or pleas. The 29th of May dawned with a gray sky that seemed to mirror the mood of the exhausted American defenders. German artillery had not ceased throughout the night, denying the soldiers any rest beyond what could be snatched between salvos. Private Donovan, his face blackened by powder smoke and streaked with tears he did not remember shedding, helped bury the dead in hastily scraped graves. The chaplain spoke prayers that were drowned by explosions, words of comfort lost in the constant thunder of bombardment. General Bullard visited the front lines that morning, defying the artillery fire to personally assess his division's condition. He moved through the ruins accompanied by Lieutenant George Marshall, both men maintaining an appearance of calm that belied the chaos surrounding them. Soldiers, seeing their general walking upright through fire that sent everyone else scrambling for cover, found their spirits lifted. Leadership, Bullard understood, sometimes required nothing more than visible presence. His inspection revealed a force tested to its limits but not yet broken. The German counterattacks resumed with increased fury, now supported by their own artillery barrages that preceded each infantry assault. The pattern became grimly familiar, a period of intense shelling followed by waves of gray-clad infantry advancing through the smoke. American defenders rising from whatever cover they could find to meet the assault with rifle and machine gun fire, desperate close quarters fighting when Germans penetrated the defenses, counterattacks to restore the line, then a brief lull before the cycle repeated. Captain Hubner, his uniform torn and bloodied though he himself remained unwounded, directed his company's defense with hoarse-voiced intensity. His men had been fighting for over 24 hours with minimal food, water, or sleep. Their ranks had thinned by nearly 40% through death and wounds. Yet they maintained their positions, driven by pride and fear in equal measure, pride in what they had accomplished, fear of the shame that would accompany failure. The village itself had ceased to exist as anything recognizable. The medieval church lay in complete ruin, its stones scattered across the square. Not a single building retained its roof. Walls stood like broken teeth, offering concealment but little protection from artillery. The streets had disappeared beneath rubble. Bodies, both American and German, lay where they had fallen, burial parties unable to retrieve them under the constant fire. The stench of death and cordite created an atmosphere that made breathing itself seem poisonous. Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt, moving through this apocalyptic landscape with seemingly charmed immunity to the shells falling around him, encountered a group of soldiers from Kansas who had reached their breaking point. They huddled in a cellar, refusing to return to their positions, their eyes reflecting a peculiar emptiness that combat veterans recognized as the soul's retreat from unbearable reality. Roosevelt spoke to them quietly, not threatening or cajoling, but simply talking about duty and honor and the necessity of their sacrifice. Slowly, one by one, they picked up their rifles and followed him back to the firing line. The French observers watching the American defense of Cantigny began to revise their assessments. These raw soldiers, many of whom had been civilians mere months before, were demonstrating resilience that matched their own poilus. They lacked the practiced efficiency of veterans, but they compensated with determination that bordered on stubbornness. When positions became untenable, American soldiers withdrew only to the next defensible point, never breaking into panicked retreat. The 30th of May brought no respite from the German attempts to reclaim Cantigny. If anything, the counterattacks intensified as Crown Prince Wilhelm committed additional reserves to the effort. The Germans recognized that allowing the Americans to hold their conquest would have implications far beyond the tactical significance of one small village. The psychological impact would resonate through both Allied and German ranks, shifting perceptions about American military capability. Sergeant Evarts, now commanding what remained of his platoon after all the officers had fallen, organized the defense of a critical section of the perimeter. His military education consisted of basic training at a camp in Georgia and hard lessons learned over the past 48 hours. Yet he deployed his men with instincts that would have earned approval from professional soldiers. He placed machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, positioned riflemen where they could cover dead ground, established fallback positions, and ensured ammunition supplies. The German assault that struck his sector came with unprecedented violence. Stormtroopers, elite assault infantry armed with grenades and light machine guns, infiltrated through the cratered landscape under cover of a precisely timed artillery barrage. They moved with the practiced efficiency of specialists, seeking to penetrate and disrupt rather than engage in frontal assault. Evarts found himself fighting at point-blank range, his rifle becoming a club when the fighting closed beyond shooting distance. Private First Class Antonio Rossi, a New York City Italian who had worked in his family's restaurant before the war, dragged wounded comrades to cover during a lull in the fighting. The medical evacuation system had broken down under the volume of casualties and the intensity of fire that prevented stretcher bearers from moving freely. Rossi made trip after trip through the shell fire, collecting wounded men and bringing them to the battalion aid station. He was killed on his 7th journey, shot through the head by a sniper. His body lay in a crater for 2 days before it could be recovered. Colonel Ely, conducting his defense from a command post that changed locations 3 times as German artillery destroyed each successive position, worked with the methodical precision of a craftsman despite his exhaustion. He rotated units between frontline positions and reserve areas, providing brief respite to the most depleted companies. He consolidated ammunition from units holding quiet sectors to reinforce those facing the heaviest pressure. He requested artillery support with specific coordinates, working closely with the French and American gunners providing fire support. The French had proved invaluable allies throughout the battle. Their artillery, directed by experienced forward observers, broke up multiple German assaults before they could close with American positions. French tank crews, working with their temperamental machines, supported counterattacks that restored breached sections of the line. French medical personnel established aid stations and evacuated American wounded alongside their own. This cooperation, forged in the fires of Cantigny, demonstrated the practical meaning of alliance beyond diplomatic abstractions. By evening of the 30th, the German attacks had diminished in intensity, though the artillery bombardment continued unabated. German commanders, assessing their casualties and the stubborn American resistance, began questioning whether Cantigny's recapture justified the expenditure of resources needed elsewhere. Their spring offensive, which had brought them tantalizingly close to Paris, was losing momentum. British and French counterattacks elsewhere on the front demanded attention. The Americans, contrary to expectations, had proven they could fight. The 31st of May arrived with a peculiar quiet that soldiers found more unnerving than the previous day's constant bombardment. The German artillery had finally slackened, firing only sporadically rather than maintaining the relentless barrage that had characterized the past 72 hours. American soldiers, hollow-eyed and trembling from exhaustion, maintained their vigilance even as they dared to hope the worst had passed. Experience had taught them that silence often preceded renewed violence. General Pershing arrived at General Bullard's headquarters that afternoon, accompanied by a contingent of staff officers and war correspondents. The commander of the American Expeditionary Forces needed to assess personally whether Cantigny represented genuine victory or merely tactical success purchased at unacceptable cost. He walked through the ruins, observing the destruction with a professional eye that noted tactical details invisible to civilian observers. The German dead sprawled in wheat fields provided testimony to the ferocity of their counterattacks. The condition of American survivors revealed the price paid to hold this conquered ground. Pershing spoke with soldiers of various ranks, from colonels to privates, gathering impressions of the battle. Lieutenant Parker, given 5 minutes with the commanding general, described the fighting with simple directness, avoiding both complaint and boast. When Pershing asked what the men needed most, Parker replied without hesitation, "Sleep, sir, and replacements." The general promised both, though he knew the former would come more readily than the latter. The American Army's training apparatus was producing soldiers by the thousands, but transporting them across the Atlantic remained bottlenecked by limited shipping. The war correspondents, granted access to the battlefield under military escort, began crafting the stories that would appear in American newspapers within days. They interviewed soldiers still blackened by powder smoke, photographed the ruins of Cantigny, collected accounts of individual heroism and collective determination, Their dispatches, subject to censorship that removed details of casualties and tactical specifics, nonetheless conveyed the essential truth. American soldiers had fought successfully against the German army. Captain Hübner, temporarily promoted to major to fill gaps in the command structure, supervised the reorganization of his battered battalion. Rosters were updated, listing the dead, wounded, and missing. Officers were reassigned to fill vacant command positions. Ammunition was redistributed. Defensive positions were improved now that engineer units could work without constant artillery fire. The mundane administrative tasks of military organization continued despite exhaustion, because armies function on bureaucracy as much as bravery. The French officially praised the American achievement with congratulatory messages from Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, and General Philippe Pétain, commander of French armies. These messages, carefully worded by diplomatic staff, acknowledged American sacrifice while subtly emphasizing continued French mentorship. The politics of coalition warfare demanded such delicate balancing. The Americans had proven themselves, but not yet established independence from Allied guidance. German prisoners captured during the counterattacks provided intelligence about enemy dispositions and plans. They spoke with surprising frankness to their interrogators, perhaps because defeat loosened tongues, or perhaps because they no longer believed German victory possible. They described receiving orders to retake Cantigny at any cost, orders that sent them repeatedly against American positions, despite mounting casualties. They expressed respect for the stubborn American defense, noting that the soldiers they faced fought with more skill than propaganda had suggested. By the 1st of June, 1918, the Battle of Cantigny had effectively concluded. The village remained in American hands, its capture and defense representing the United States' first significant offensive operation in the Great War. The victory's strategic importance was modest. Cantigny possessed limited tactical value in the war's larger context, but its symbolic significance transcended military calculation. The casualty figures compiled in the battle's aftermath painted a sobering picture of modern warfare's destructive efficiency. The 1st Division suffered over 1,000 casualties during the 4 days of fighting, 299 killed in action, over 500 wounded severely enough to require evacuation, and scores more suffering injuries that did not warrant removal from duty. These numbers, meticulously recorded in regimental logs and medical reports, represented sons and husbands who would never return home, men who would carry physical and psychological scars for whatever years remained to them. Sergeant Evarts had survived the battle physically intact, but found himself changed in ways he struggled to articulate. He wrote letters to the families of men from his squad who had died, trying to find words that might provide comfort, while knowing that no phrase could truly console mothers mourning sons or wives mourning husbands. He described brave deaths and quick ends, editing out the prolonged suffering and terror that characterized most battlefield demises. These compassionate lies represented a final service to fallen comrades. The German casualties exceeded American losses by significant margins, though exact figures remained disputed. Conservative estimates placed German dead and wounded at over 1,500 during the counterattacks alone. The wheat fields east of Cantigny bore witness to the price German commanders paid attempting to reclaim the village. Bodies lay in rows where machine gun fire had caught assault formations in the open. The Germans eventually retrieved most of their dead under informal truces, burying them in mass graves that would be discovered and properly marked only after the war's conclusion. Private Donovan received promotion to corporal, advancement earned by survival as much as merit. So many men had fallen that gaps in the rank structure required filling, and those who endured the battle with their sanity intact qualified for leadership by default. Donovan accepted the new stripes with mixed emotions, understanding that they brought responsibility he never sought. He would spend the remaining months of the war trying to keep men alive, a task that would prove far more difficult than killing enemies. Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt, who had walked through artillery fire as if protected by divine providence, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the battle. He accepted the medal with characteristic modesty, insisting that every soldier in the division deserved equal recognition. Roosevelt would continue serving through the war's end, surviving combat that killed so many of his contemporaries, only to die from wounds in 1944 during the Second World War's Normandy invasion. His destiny was bound to battlefields across 2 generations. The medical personnel who treated the wounded at battalion aid stations and field hospitals demonstrated heroism that rarely received public recognition. Doctors operated under impossible conditions, working by candlelight in cellars that shook from artillery fire, performing amputations and emergency surgeries with inadequate supplies and no rest. Nurses, officially banned from frontline service but present nonetheless, provided care that meant the difference between survival and death for countless soldiers. Their names seldom appeared in official accounts, but their service was no less vital than those who carried rifles. The lessons learned at Cantigny were compiled by staff officers and distributed throughout the American Expeditionary Forces. Tactical reports noted the importance of thorough preparation, the necessity of combined arms coordination between infantry and artillery, the value of French tanks and flamethrowers in reducing fortified positions. They emphasized the need for rapid consolidation of captured territory and preparation for inevitable counterattacks. These observations, written in the dry language of military doctrine, represented knowledge purchased with blood. The months following Cantigny saw the American Army expand its role in the Great War with growing confidence. The 1st Division's success opened doors to larger operations. Château-Thierry, Belleau-Wood, Saint-Mihiel, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. American soldiers fought in all these battles with the determination first demonstrated at Cantigny, gradually earning their place alongside French and British allies as full partners in the coalition struggling against the Central Powers. The village itself returned to its civilian inhabitants after the armistice, its stones bearing scars that would remain visible for generations. Colonel Ely received promotion to Brigadier General, recognition for his competent leadership during those critical days in May. He would serve in the Army through the interwar years, helping to institutionalize the lessons learned during the World War. Many of his subordinates from Cantigny followed similar career paths, the battle serving as crucible that identified officers worthy of higher command. When the Second World War arrived, men who had been lieutenants at Cantigny held general stars, their understanding of combat forged in French wheat fields. General Bullard wrote in his memoirs that Cantigny represented the moment when American soldiers transitioned from promise to reality. They had endured the supreme test of combat and emerged with honor intact. The victory, modest though it was in isolation, provided proof that American arms could compete on European battlefields. It silenced critics who had questioned whether the United States possessed the martial spirit necessary for modern warfare. More importantly, it gave American soldiers confidence in themselves and their leaders, confidence that would prove essential in the battles ahead. The village of Cantigny today maintains a memorial to the Americans who fought there. A monument stands near where the medieval church once rose, bearing names of the dead and an inscription commemorating their sacrifice. French and American flags fly together, symbol of the alliance forged in shared struggle. Veterans of the battle, those few who survived into old age, occasionally returned to walk the ground where they had fought as young men, searching perhaps for meaning in sacrifice that the passage of years made increasingly difficult to comprehend. The broader historical significance of Cantigny extends beyond its immediate military results. The battle announced America's arrival as a world power willing and able to project military force across oceans. It validated President Woodrow Wilson's decision to commit American troops to the European conflict, despite significant domestic opposition. It demonstrated that the United States possessed not only industrial might, but also soldiers capable of enduring modern warfare's terrible demands. These strategic implications would shape international relations throughout the 20th century. Private Donovan survived the war and returned to Boston, where he worked as a police officer until his retirement in 1950. He rarely spoke of his wartime service, even to family members who expressed curiosity about the medals stored in a dresser drawer. Like many combat veterans, he found that experiences gained in battle translated poorly to civilian life. The bonds formed with men who had died at Cantigny remained stronger in some ways than relationships with the living. He attended 1st Division reunions when health permitted, finding community with others who shared memories that outsiders could never fully understand. The 28th of May, 1918, marked a turning point not just in military history but in America's conception of itself and its role in world affairs. The soldiers who climbed from their trenches that morning and advanced across contested ground carried with them the hopes and doubts of a nation uncertain about its martial capabilities. They returned, those who survived, having proven that Americans could fight with the courage and effectiveness that modern warfare demanded. Cantigny stands as testament to their achievement, a village whose name entered history because young men chose to advance rather than retreat, to hold rather than yield, to sacrifice rather than fail. Their legacy endures not in grand strategic victories but in the simple fact that when tested, they did not break.